Question 1. Market research demonstrates that a new, less expensive antivirus software solution is available that meets the minimum compliance requirements for data protection, but offers significantly fewer advanced threat detection and response capabilities compared to the currently recommended, more costly option. Management is pushing for the adoption of the cheaper software to reduce IT expenditure. As a construction risk and insurance specialist, you are tasked with advising on this decision. Which approach best upholds your professional responsibilities? Option A. Accept the cheaper antivirus software and conduct a superficial review of its capabilities, hoping it will suffice without raising further concerns to management. Option B. Advocate for the adoption of the more robust, albeit more expensive, antivirus software, providing a detailed risk assessment that quantifies the potential costs of a cyber incident versus the software's price, and clearly documenting the limitations of the cheaper alternative. Option C. Inform management that the decision is solely theirs and provide no further recommendation, as budget allocation is outside your purview. Option D. Implement the cheaper antivirus software immediately to satisfy management's cost-saving directive, assuming that meeting minimum compliance is sufficient. The correct answer is B. Advocate for the adoption of the more robust, albeit more expensive, antivirus software, providing a detailed risk assessment that quantifies the potential costs of a cyber incident versus the software's price, and clearly documenting the limitations of the cheaper alternative. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it forces a specialist to balance the immediate cost-saving pressures from management against the long-term risks and regulatory obligations associated with cybersecurity. The specialist's duty is to protect the firm's assets and client data, which includes ensuring adequate cybersecurity measures are in place. The decision is complicated by the potential for financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust if a breach occurs due to insufficient protection. The correct approach involves prioritizing the firm's cybersecurity posture by advocating for the necessary antivirus software, even if it incurs additional costs. This aligns with the ethical duty of care and the implicit regulatory expectation that firms will take reasonable steps to protect sensitive information. Specifically, in the context of the construction risk and insurance specialist CRIS exam's presumed U.S. regulatory framework, this would involve adhering to principles of prudent risk management and potentially specific data protection regulations. Though the exam focuses on risk and insurance, the underlying principles of safeguarding information are paramount. The specialist must demonstrate that the cost of the software is a necessary investment to mitigate far greater potential losses from a cyber incident, which could include regulatory fines, legal liabilities, and business interruption. An incorrect approach would be to accept the cheaper, less effective antivirus software without thorough due diligence and clear documentation of the risks. This fails to uphold the specialist's professional responsibility to advise on and implement appropriate risk mitigation strategies. Ethically, it constitutes a dereliction of duty by prioritizing short-term cost savings over robust security. From a regulatory perspective, it could be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting sensitive data, potentially violating principles of data security and risk management expected of professionals in regulated industries. Another incorrect approach would be to defer the decision entirely to management without providing a clear, risk-based recommendation. While management has the final say on budget allocation, the specialist has a professional obligation to provide expert advice based on a thorough assessment of risks and available mitigation options. Failing to do so abdicates responsibility and leaves the firm vulnerable without informed guidance. A third incorrect approach would be to implement the cheaper software and hope for the best, without any further risk assessment or communication of the identified vulnerabilities. This is a passive and negligent stance that does not address the underlying risk. It fails to meet the professional standard of proactive risk management and informed decision-making. Professionals should approach such situations by first conducting a comprehensive risk assessment of the proposed antivirus solutions, clearly documenting the capabilities and limitations of each. This assessment should then be translated into a clear, concise recommendation to management, outlining the risks associated with the less effective option and the benefits of the recommended solution, framed in terms of potential financial and operational impacts. The decision-making process should involve clear communication, documentation of advice given, and a record of management's final decision and its rationale, ensuring accountability and transparency. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood and high severity rating for a critical structural failure during the erection phase of a complex bridge project. Which fault tree analysis, FTA approach would be most appropriate for investigating this identified risk, ensuring compliance with construction risk management best practices? Option A. Highly quantitative FTA requiring detailed statistical failure data for all bridge components. Option B. A top-down qualitative FTA starting with the undesirable event of structural collapse and systematically identifying contributing factors. Option C. An FTA focused exclusively on human error during the erection process. Option D. A bottom-up FTA that begins by analyzing individual component failure probabilities. The correct answer is B. A top-down qualitative FTA starting with the undesirable event of structural collapse and systematically identifying contributing factors. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the specialist to interpret a qualitative risk assessment tool, the risk matrix, and translate its findings into a specific risk mitigation technique, fault tree analysis FTA, while adhering to the regulatory framework governing construction projects. The specialist must demonstrate an understanding of how to select the most appropriate FTA approach based on the identified risk level and the project's context, ensuring compliance with industry standards and potentially contractual obligations. The correct approach involves selecting a top-down FTA that begins with a specific undesirable event, e.g., structural collapse, and systematically identifies the contributing basic events or component failures that could lead to it. This method is appropriate because the risk matrix has identified a high-severity, high-probability event, necessitating a detailed investigation into the causal chain. This aligns with regulatory expectations for thorough risk assessment and mitigation planning in construction, particularly for high-risk scenarios. The chosen FTA should be qualitative or semi-quantitative, focusing on the logical relationships between events rather than precise probability calculations, which is consistent with the typical output of a risk matrix and the conceptual nature of FTA in this context. This approach ensures that all potential failure pathways are considered, allowing for targeted preventative measures. An incorrect approach would be to immediately jump to a bottom-up FTA, without first defining the specific high-consequence event indicated by the risk matrix. A bottom-up approach, which starts with basic component failures and builds up to system-level failures, is less effective when the primary concern is a specific, high-impact undesirable event already identified. This fails to directly address the most critical risk highlighted by the matrix and may overlook systemic issues that contribute to the top event. Another incorrect approach would be to select an FTA that focuses solely on human error, without considering the broader system and equipment failures that the risk matrix suggests are contributing to the high-risk rating. While human error is a critical factor in many construction incidents, an FTA must be comprehensive and reflect all potential contributing factors identified through the risk assessment process. Ignoring other failure modes would lead to an incomplete analysis and potentially ineffective mitigation strategies, violating the principle of thorough risk management. Finally, choosing an FTA that is overly complex and quantitative, requiring detailed statistical data that is not readily available or implied by the risk matrix, would also be an incorrect approach. The risk matrix provides a qualitative or semi-quantitative assessment, and the subsequent FTA should be tailored to that level of detail. Overly complex quantitative FTAs can be time-consuming, resource-intensive, and may not yield significantly more actionable insights than a well-executed qualitative or semi-quantitative analysis when the initial risk assessment is not based on precise statistical data. The professional reasoning process should involve 1. Understanding the output of the risk matrix, specifically the identified high-risk event and its severity/probability rating. 2. Identifying the most suitable FTA methodology that directly addresses this high-risk event and aligns with the level of detail provided by the risk matrix. 3. Ensuring the chosen FTA methodology facilitates the identification of root causes and contributing factors for targeted risk mitigation. 4. Considering project constraints and available data when selecting the complexity of the FTA. Question 3. Research into the impact of project delays on construction insurance policies, a project manager discovers that the original policy's expiration date will pass before substantial completion. The project manager needs to determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure continuous insurance coverage. Option A. Assume the existing policy will automatically renew under the same terms and conditions, as is common practice for many service contracts. Option B. Advise the contractor to continue work without updated insurance, as most policies have a grace period for minor delays. Option C. Immediately contact the insurer to discuss the possibility of a policy extension, providing details of the revised project timeline and any new risks identified due to the delay. Option D. Request the contractor to obtain a new, separate policy that covers the extended period, without consulting the original insurer about the existing policy status. The correct answer is C. Immediately contact the insurer to discuss the possibility of a policy extension, providing details of the revised project timeline and any new risks identified due to the delay. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a specialist to navigate the complexities of insurance policy extensions and renewals within the specific regulatory framework governing construction projects. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the insurance coverage remains adequate and compliant throughout the project lifecycle, especially when unforeseen circumstances necessitate an extension. A failure to properly manage these aspects can lead to significant financial and legal repercussions for all parties involved. The correct approach involves proactively assessing the need for an extension, understanding the policy's provisions regarding extensions and renewals, and communicating clearly with the insurer to secure appropriate coverage. This ensures that the project's risk profile is accurately reflected in the insurance terms, thereby maintaining compliance with contractual obligations and regulatory requirements. Specifically, this approach aligns with the principles of prudent risk management and the duty of care owed to the insured, emphasizing the importance of informed decision-making and transparent communication with insurers to avoid coverage gaps. An incorrect approach would be to assume that existing coverage automatically extends or that a renewal will be granted without review. This failure to actively manage the extension and renewal process can lead to a lapse in coverage, leaving the project exposed to uninsured risks. Such an oversight would be a direct contravention of the specialist's professional duty to ensure adequate insurance protection, and could violate specific clauses within the construction contract or relevant insurance regulations that mandate continuous and appropriate coverage. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the contractor's assertion that an extension is covered without independent verification from the insurer. This bypasses the critical step of confirming the insurer's agreement and the specific terms of the extension, potentially leading to a misunderstanding of coverage limits, exclusions, or premium adjustments. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the established processes for modifying insurance policies, which could have serious regulatory implications if it results in a breach of contractual insurance requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the insurance policy's terms and conditions related to extensions and renewals. This involves consulting policy documents, engaging in open dialogue with the insurer, and documenting all communications and agreements. A proactive and diligent approach, grounded in regulatory compliance and ethical responsibility, is essential to mitigate risks and ensure the integrity of the insurance program throughout the construction project. Question 4. To address the challenge of potential libel and slander arising from a dispute over subcontractor performance on a major infrastructure project, which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and professional guidelines for a construction risk and insurance specialist operating within the United States? Option A. Conduct a thorough, objective investigation into the subcontractor's performance, gathering all relevant documentation and expert opinions, and consult with legal counsel before making any formal statements or recommendations. Option B. Advise the client to terminate the subcontractor's contract without further investigation, based on the client's verbal complaints and the specialist's general experience with similar issues. Option C. Immediately issue a public statement to all project stakeholders detailing the subcontractor's alleged failures, citing personal observations and industry gossip as evidence. Option D. Post critical, unsubstantiated comments about the subcontractor's competence on industry-specific online forums to warn other potential clients. The correct answer is C. Immediately issue a public statement to all project stakeholders detailing the subcontractor's alleged failures, citing personal observations and industry gossip as evidence. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it involves potential reputational damage and legal liability stemming from statements made during a construction project. The specialist must navigate the fine line between expressing professional opinions and making defamatory statements, understanding that even unintentional misstatements can have severe consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure all communications are factual, objective, and adhere to professional standards and relevant legal frameworks. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the facts and consultation with legal counsel before making any public statements that could be construed as libelous or slanderous. This is justified by the regulatory framework governing professional conduct, which mandates accuracy, fairness, and avoidance of actions that could harm the reputation of others. Specifically, professional bodies often have codes of ethics that require members to act with integrity and to refrain from making unsubstantiated or malicious statements. Legal counsel can advise on the specific elements of libel and slander under applicable law, ensuring that any communication is legally sound and minimizes risk. An approach that involves making immediate public statements based on incomplete information or personal assumptions is incorrect. This fails to meet the professional obligation to verify facts and could lead to statements that are false and damaging, constituting slander, if spoken, or libel, if written. Such actions violate ethical codes that require due diligence and could expose the specialist and their firm to significant legal penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to remain silent and avoid any communication, even when there is a professional obligation to inform stakeholders about project-related issues. A caution is necessary. Complete silence can sometimes be interpreted as an admission of fault or a lack of transparency, potentially leading to other forms of liability or loss of trust. The professional duty often includes clear and accurate communication within defined boundaries. Finally, relying solely on anecdotal evidence or hearsay to form public statements is professionally unacceptable. This bypasses the requirement for objective evidence and factual verification, increasing the likelihood of making false and defamatory remarks. Professional standards and legal principles demand that statements, especially those that could impact reputation, be based on credible and verifiable information. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify the potential for reputational or legal risk. Second, gather all relevant facts and evidence objectively. Third, assess the potential impact of any communication. Fourth, consult with legal counsel to understand specific legal obligations and risks. And fifth, communicate clearly, accurately, and professionally, adhering to all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. Question 5. Analysis of the most effective and regulatory compliant method for establishing a crisis management team within a construction firm, considering the need for preparedness and clear accountability in the event of a significant project disruption or site emergency. Option A. Form a cross-functional team with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and communication protocols, ensuring representation from key operational, legal, and communications departments, and conducting regular training and simulations. Option B. Appoint only senior executives to the crisis management team, assuming their experience will be sufficient to manage any crisis without specific role definitions or dedicated training. Option C. Create a crisis management team composed solely of technical experts directly involved in project execution, excluding individuals from legal, finance, or public relations. Option D. Assemble the crisis management team only when a crisis occurs, selecting members based on their immediate availability and willingness to participate. The correct answer is A. Form a cross-functional team with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and communication protocols, ensuring representation from key operational, legal, and communications departments, and conducting regular training and simulations. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because establishing a crisis management team requires a proactive and structured approach to ensure compliance with regulatory expectations for business continuity and risk mitigation in the construction industry. The challenge lies in identifying the appropriate individuals and defining their roles and responsibilities in a way that is both effective during a crisis and compliant with relevant regulations, which often mandate preparedness and clear lines of authority. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for immediate response with the long-term strategic implications of team composition and training. The correct approach involves forming a cross-functional team with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and communication protocols, ensuring representation from key operational, legal, and communications departments, and conducting regular training and simulations. This approach is right because it directly addresses the core principles of crisis management mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize preparedness, clear accountability, and effective communication during emergencies. Specifically, regulations often require organizations to have plans in place to manage disruptions, protect stakeholders, and maintain essential operations, all of which are facilitated by a well-structured and trained crisis management team. This proactive and comprehensive method ensures that the team is equipped to respond effectively and in accordance with legal and ethical obligations. An incorrect approach of solely appointing senior executives without defined roles or specific training fails because it neglects the practical need for specialized expertise and operational knowledge within the crisis team. Regulations often imply a need for competence and preparedness, which cannot be assumed solely based on seniority. This approach risks a fragmented and ineffective response due to a lack of clarity on who is responsible for what, potentially leading to delays and noncompliance with emergency response mandates. Another incorrect approach of forming a team based only on immediate availability during a crisis, without prior planning or defined responsibilities, is professionally unacceptable. This reactive strategy directly contravenes regulatory expectations for pre-established crisis management plans and preparedness. It leads to confusion, potential conflicts of interest, and an inability to execute a coordinated and efficient response, thereby failing to meet the duty of care and regulatory obligations to manage risks and protect stakeholders during an emergency. A further incorrect approach of limiting the team to only technical personnel overlooks the critical need for broader organizational perspectives, including legal, financial, and public relations expertise, which are essential for a holistic crisis response. Regulations often require consideration of all impacted stakeholders and legal ramifications, which a technically focused team may not adequately address, leading to potential legal and reputational damage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of applicable regulatory requirements for crisis preparedness and business continuity. This includes identifying potential crisis scenarios relevant to the construction industry, assessing their potential impact, and then designing a crisis management team structure that ensures adequate representation, clear roles, robust communication channels, and regular training and testing. The team's composition should reflect the diverse needs of the organization during a crisis, encompassing operational, legal, financial, communications, and human resources functions. Question 6. The investigation demonstrates that a critical piece of heavy machinery on a construction site experienced a sudden and unexpected failure during operation, resulting in significant damage. The insured party immediately reported the incident, emphasizing the operational impact and the need for rapid repair. The insurer's initial assessment needs to determine the appropriate course of action regarding the equipment breakdown insurance policy. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and professional responsibilities for assessing this claim? Option A. Advise the insured that such operational failures are common in construction and likely fall under general liability coverage, suggesting they pursue a claim through that policy instead. Option B. Immediately authorize repairs and replacement of damaged components, assuming the equipment breakdown insurance policy will cover the loss due to the sudden and unexpected nature of the failure. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of the equipment breakdown insurance policy, focusing on the definition of covered equipment, the insuring agreements for mechanical and electrical breakdown, and any exclusions related to wear and tear, lack of maintenance, or operational misuse, while also investigating the root cause of the failure. Option D. Proceed with a preliminary assessment of the repair costs and inform the insured that the claim will be processed based on the estimated expenses, without a definitive confirmation of coverage at this stage. The correct answer is B. Immediately authorize repairs and replacement of damaged components, assuming the equipment breakdown insurance policy will cover the loss due to the sudden and unexpected nature of the failure. Explanation: the investigation demonstrates a complex scenario involving a significant equipment breakdown at a construction site, necessitating a thorough understanding of equipment breakdown insurance, also known as boiler and machinery coverage, under the relevant regulatory framework for the construction risk and insurance specialist CRIS exam. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope of coverage, identifying potential exclusions, and ensuring the claims process aligns with policy terms and regulatory expectations, particularly concerning the reporting and investigation of such incidents. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between covered perils and those that may fall outside the policy's purview, such as wear and tear or pre-existing conditions, which are typically excluded. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the equipment breakdown insurance policy, focusing on the definitions of covered equipment, the specified perils, and any applicable deductibles or sublimits. This approach requires a detailed examination of the cause of the breakdown to determine if it aligns with the policy's insuring agreements and does not fall under any exclusions. Regulatory justification stems from the principle of utmost good faith, requiring insurers and insured parties to act honestly and transparently. Furthermore, regulatory frameworks often mandate clear policy language and fair claims handling practices, ensuring that coverage is provided as agreed. This approach upholds the contractual obligations and regulatory compliance expected of insurance professionals. An incorrect approach would be to assume coverage based solely on the fact that equipment broke down. This fails to acknowledge the specific terms and conditions of the equipment breakdown insurance policy, which is a contract of indemnity. Regulatory and ethical failures here include a lack of due diligence and potentially misrepresenting coverage to the insured, which violates the principle of utmost good faith and could lead to regulatory sanctions for unfair claims settlement practices. Another incorrect approach is to immediately attribute the breakdown to external factors without a thorough investigation into the equipment's operational history and maintenance records. Equipment breakdown insurance typically covers sudden and accidental mechanical or electrical breakdown, not gradual deterioration or lack of maintenance. Failing to investigate these aspects and instead broadly applying coverage would be a violation of policy terms and regulatory requirements for proper claims investigation. This could also lead to adverse selection and increased claims costs for the insurer, impacting the broader market. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the cost of repair or replacement without first establishing policy coverage. While financial implications are important, the primary determinant of an insurer's liability is whether the loss is covered under the policy. Proceeding with repair authorization without confirming coverage could result in the insurer paying for a non-covered loss, which is a breach of their fiduciary duty to policyholders and a violation of solvency regulations designed to protect the insurance fund. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation. First, confirm the existence and terms of the equipment breakdown insurance policy. Second, thoroughly investigate the cause and circumstances of the breakdown, gathering all relevant documentation. Third, compare the findings against the policy's insuring agreements and exclusions. Fourth, consult with technical experts if necessary to understand the nature of the breakdown. And finally, communicate the coverage determination clearly and promptly to the insured, adhering to all regulatory requirements for claims handling. Question 7. During the evaluation of a commercial property insurance application, a client expresses concern about disclosing a minor, past, and unrelated zoning violation that they believe is irrelevant to the current property's insurability. They request that this information be omitted from the declaration section, stating it was a one-time issue that has been resolved and will not impact the property's use or value. As the specialist evaluating the application, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Inform the client that while disclosure is generally important, you will make an executive decision to exclude this specific violation based on your professional judgment of its insignificance. Option B. Unilaterally decide that the zoning violation is not material to the risk and proceed with the application without disclosing it, assuming the insurer will not discover it. Option C. Agree to the client's request and omit the zoning violation from the declaration section, as the client believes it is minor and resolved, and you also believe it is unlikely to affect the insurer's decision. Option D. Advise the client that all known zoning violations, regardless of perceived materiality or past occurrence, must be disclosed in the declaration section to uphold the principle of utmost good faith and comply with regulatory requirements for accurate representation. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that all known zoning violations, regardless of perceived materiality or past occurrence, must be disclosed in the declaration section to uphold the principle of utmost good faith and comply with regulatory requirements for accurate representation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire to minimize perceived risk and the insurer's need for accurate and complete information to underwrite the policy effectively. The declaration section of an insurance policy is a critical component, forming the basis of the insurer's agreement. Misrepresentations or omissions in this section can have significant legal and financial consequences for all parties involved. Careful judgment is required to balance client advocacy with the ethical and legal obligations of an insurance professional. The correct approach involves clearly explaining to the client the purpose and legal implications of the declaration section, emphasizing the importance of truthful and complete disclosure. This approach upholds the principle of utmost good faith, uberrimi fidei, a cornerstone of insurance law, which requires all parties to act with honesty and transparency. By educating the client and advising them to provide accurate information, the professional ensures compliance with regulatory requirements that mandate truthful representations in insurance applications and policy declarations. This aligns with the ethical duty to act with integrity and competence, safeguarding both the client and the insurer from potential disputes and coverage issues arising from misrepresentation. An incorrect approach that involves agreeing to the client's request to omit information, even if the client believes it is minor or irrelevant, constitutes a failure to uphold the duty of utmost good faith. This action could be construed as aiding in misrepresentation, which is a violation of insurance regulations and ethical standards. Such an omission could invalidate the policy or lead to denial of claims, exposing the client to significant financial loss and the professional to disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach, that of unilaterally deciding to omit the information without client consultation, is equally problematic. This bypasses the client's right to make informed decisions about their insurance coverage and misrepresents the client's own understanding of the risks. It also fails to adequately inform the insurer of all material facts, thereby undermining the underwriting process and potentially leading to an improperly priced or underwritten policy. A further incorrect approach, that of simply stating that the information is not material without proper investigation or consultation with the underwriter, is a failure of due diligence. Materiality is a complex determination that often depends on the specific circumstances and the insurer's underwriting guidelines. An insurance professional's role is to facilitate accurate disclosure, not to make unilateral judgments about materiality that could prejudice the insurer. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the client's concerns and motivations. 2. Clearly explaining the legal and contractual significance of the declaration section and the principle of utmost good faith. 3. Advising the client on the importance of full and truthful disclosure. 4. If the client remains hesitant, consulting with the insurer's underwriter to understand their perspective on the information and its potential impact on the policy. 5. Documenting all communications and advice provided to the client. Question 8. Compliance review shows that a large infrastructure project has encountered significant unforeseen ground conditions, leading to substantial delays and increased costs. The project contract allocates the risk of unforeseen ground conditions to the employer. The employer specialist insurance policy includes a clause for contingent professional risks, but is silent on specific coverage for ground conditions. The specialist is asked to advise the employer on the best course of action. Option A. Advise the employer to absorb all additional costs and delays as an inherent risk of construction projects without further investigation. Option B. Advise the employer to immediately suspend the project until the ground conditions are fully understood and resolved, without consulting the contract or insurance policy. Option C. Advise the employer to notify the insurer of a potential claim under the Contingent Professional Risks Clause and proceed with the claim for additional costs and time extensions, while also reviewing the contract for employer's entitlement to time extensions. Option D. Advise the employer that the contractor is solely responsible for all additional costs and delays due to unforeseen ground conditions, regardless of the contract. Correct answer is C. Advise the employer to notify the insurer of a potential claim under the Contingent Professional Risks Clause and proceed with the claim for additional costs and time extensions, while also reviewing the contract for employer's entitlement to time extensions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in construction projects where unforeseen ground conditions significantly impact project timelines and costs. The professional challenge lies in balancing the contractual obligations of the parties, the insurer's duty to indemnify, and the need for timely project progression. The specialist must navigate the complexities of the contract, the insurance policy wording, and the applicable regulatory framework to determine the appropriate course of action, ensuring fair treatment of all stakeholders while adhering to professional standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the project contract and the relevant insurance policy. Specifically, the specialist must ascertain if the contract defines ground conditions as a risk allocated to the contractor or the employer, and if the insurance policy provides coverage for such unforeseen conditions under its terms, such as a professional risks or latent defects clause. If the contract places the risk on the employer and the policy covers it, then the specialist should advise the employer to notify the insurer and proceed with a claim for the additional costs and time extensions. This aligns with the principle of indemnity, where the insured is put back in the position they would have been in had the loss not occurred, and adheres to the contractual allocation of risk. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the employer to absorb all additional costs without investigating the contract and policy is incorrect, because it potentially breaches the employer's duty to mitigate loss and may overlook contractual risk allocation or insurance coverage, leading to financial detriment and potential disputes. Suggesting the contractor bear all costs solely based on the discovery of unforeseen conditions is incorrect, as it ignores the contractual risk allocation and the potential for insurance coverage. This approach could lead to a breach of contract by the employer if the contract places this risk elsewhere, or if insurance is available. Recommending immediate project suspension without consulting the contract or policy is incorrect because it may not be contractually permissible, could exacerbate losses, and fails to explore available avenues for cost recovery or time extension through contractual mechanisms or insurance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach. First, meticulously review the project contract to understand the allocation of risks, particularly concerning ground conditions. Second, thoroughly examine the relevant insurance policies to identify coverage for unforeseen events, including policy exclusions and conditions precedent to a claim. Third, consult with legal counsel if contractual or policy interpretation is ambiguous. Finally, advise the client based on a comprehensive understanding of their contractual rights and obligations, and their insurance entitlements, prioritizing fair risk allocation and adherence to regulatory requirements. Question 9. Operational review demonstrates that current site material handling procedures are time-consuming and contribute to project delays. To optimize processes and reduce costs, management is considering implementing a new automated system. However, the proposed system requires significant upfront investment and a substantial shift in existing workflows, with potential implications for worker training and site layout. Which approach best balances the need for process optimization with the imperative to maintain operational safety and regulatory compliance? Option A. Postpone the implementation of the new system indefinitely due to the upfront investment and potential disruption, continuing with the current, albeit less efficient, material handling procedures. Option B. Immediately implement the new automated system to realize cost savings and efficiency gains, assuming that existing safety measures will be sufficient to mitigate any new risks. Option C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the new automated system, including its impact on worker safety, existing safety protocols, and compliance with relevant construction regulations, followed by a phased implementation plan with comprehensive training for all affected personnel. Option D. Implement the new automated system with minimal training, relying on the manufacturer's basic operational guidelines and assuming workers will adapt quickly to the new workflows. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment of the new automated system, including its impact on worker safety, existing safety protocols, and compliance with relevant construction regulations, followed by a phased implementation plan with comprehensive training for all affected personnel. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost savings with the long-term implications for operational resilience and compliance within the construction industry. A hasty decision could lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and, most importantly, increased risk of project delays and safety incidents. Careful judgment is required to ensure that process optimization efforts do not inadvertently compromise established safety protocols or regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment and a phased implementation of changes, prioritizing those that enhance efficiency without compromising safety or compliance. This aligns with the principles of responsible risk management and the proactive identification and mitigation of operational hazards, which are fundamental to maintaining a safe and compliant construction environment. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing workplace safety and project management in the construction sector, emphasize a systematic approach to change management that includes thorough impact analysis and stakeholder consultation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without considering the potential impact on safety procedures or regulatory adherence is professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct a thorough risk assessment violates the duty of care owed to workers and the public, and it can lead to non-compliance with statutory obligations. Another incorrect approach, which involves implementing changes without adequate training or communication to the workforce, creates a significant risk of human error and operational disruption, undermining the intended benefits of process optimization and potentially leading to accidents or breaches of contract. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the operational review findings and their potential implications. This framework should include: 1. Identifying all potential risks associated with proposed changes, including safety, compliance, and operational efficiency risks. 2. Evaluating the severity and likelihood of each identified risk. 3. Developing mitigation strategies for high-priority risks. 4. Consulting with relevant stakeholders, including site personnel, safety officers, and legal counsel, to gather input and ensure buy-in. 5. Implementing changes in a controlled, phased manner with robust monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. 6. Ensuring all changes are documented and communicated effectively to all affected parties. Question 10. Comparative studies suggest that construction projects often span multiple states, leading to complex jurisdictional challenges in workers' compensation compliance. A construction firm, headquartered in State A, is undertaking a significant project in State B and anticipates sending several employees to perform work there for an extended period. The firm currently holds a workers' compensation policy that complies with the laws of State A. Which of the following approaches best addresses the firm's risk assessment regarding workers' compensation for this multi-state project? Option A. Obtain a separate workers' compensation policy specifically for State B without first reviewing the existing policy for potential extraterritorial coverage or the specific statutory requirements of State B. Option B. Verify that the existing workers' compensation policy includes extraterritorial coverage provisions that extend to State B, and confirm that the policy's benefit levels and reporting requirements meet or exceed the statutory mandates of State B. Option C. Rely solely on the advice of the insurance broker who issued the state a policy to confirm that coverage extends to State B, without independent verification of State B's specific workers' compensation statutes. Option D. Assume the existing workers' compensation policy is sufficient because the firm's principal place of business is in State A, and workers' compensation laws are generally standardized across states. The correct answer is B. Verify that the existing workers' compensation policy includes extraterritorial coverage provisions that extend to State B, and confirm that the policy's benefit levels and reporting requirements meet or exceed the statutory mandates of State B. Explanation: the scenario presents a common challenge for construction risk and insurance specialists, navigating the complexities of state-specific workers' compensation laws when a project involves multiple states. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying and complying with the unique statutory requirements of each jurisdiction where employees will be working, as noncompliance can lead to significant financial penalties, legal liabilities, and operational disruptions. Careful judgment is required to avoid overinsuring or underinsuring, and to ensure that coverage aligns with the specific risks and legal obligations in each state. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment that prioritizes understanding and adhering to the specific workers' compensation statutes of each state where employees are performing work. This means identifying which state's laws apply based on factors such as the location of the principal place of business, the location where the contract was entered into, and crucially, the location where the work is performed. This approach ensures that the employer meets its statutory obligations, provides adequate benefits to injured workers as mandated by law, and avoids penalties for noncompliance. Regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principle that workers' compensation is a creature of state statute, and each state has its own exclusive set of rules regarding coverage, benefits, and employer responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a single state's workers' compensation policy automatically covers employees working in other states without verifying extraterritorial coverage provisions or the applicability of other states' laws. This failure to conduct a state-specific risk assessment can lead to a gap in coverage, leaving the employer exposed to claims that are not covered by their existing policy and potentially violating the laws of the state where the work is performed. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the advice of a single insurance broker without independently verifying the compliance of the proposed coverage with the laws of all relevant states. This can result in a misinterpretation of coverage needs or a failure to account for specific state mandates, such as exclusive remedy provisions or specific benefit levels. A third incorrect approach is to only consider the state where the company is headquartered, ignoring the statutory requirements of states where employees are actively engaged in construction activities. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of workers' compensation jurisdiction, which is typically determined by the status of employment and work performed, not solely by the employer's domicile. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive identification of all states where construction activities will occur. For each identified state, the specialist must then research and understand the specific workers' compensation laws, including benefit levels, reporting requirements, and any reciprocal agreements between states. This research should inform the procurement of insurance policies that explicitly provide for extraterritorial coverage and comply with the statutory requirements of each relevant jurisdiction. Regular review and consultation with legal counsel specializing in workers' compensation law in those states are also critical components of a robust risk management process. Question 11. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive understanding of potential risks. In the context of a large-scale infrastructure project, what is the most prudent approach for a contractor to manage the risk of significant material price fluctuations that could arise over the project's multi-year duration, ensuring compliance with industry best practices and regulatory expectations? Option A. Rely on the client's goodwill to absorb any material price increases that occur during construction, without any specific contractual provisions addressing such eventualities. Option B. Incorporate a well-defined material price escalation clause into the contract, outlining the specific materials covered, the basis for price adjustments, e.g., published indices, and a clear process for notification and agreement on revised pricing. Option C. Include a broad force majeure clause that broadly covers all economic uncertainties, including material price hikes, allowing for unilateral contract renegotiation at the contractor's discretion. Option D. Bid the project at a fixed price, assuming market stability, and addressing any cost overruns from material price increases through contingency funds allocated solely for unforeseen site conditions. The correct answer is B. Incorporate a well-defined material price escalation clause into the contract, outlining the specific materials covered, the basis for price adjustments, e.g., published indices, and a clear process for notification and agreement on revised pricing. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because material price fluctuations can significantly impact project budgets, timelines, and profitability, creating tension between the contractor's need for cost certainty and the client's expectation of a fixed price. Navigating these risks requires a proactive and informed approach to contract negotiation and risk allocation, adhering strictly to the principles and regulations governing construction contracts within the specified jurisdiction. The correct approach involves proactively identifying potential material price volatility during the bidding and contract negotiation phases, and incorporating appropriate risk mitigation strategies into the contract. This might include mechanisms like escalation clauses, provisional sums for specific high-risk materials, or a clearly defined process for adjusting the contract price based on documented price changes. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on transparency, fairness, and the allocation of risks to the party best able to manage them. It promotes a collaborative approach to risk management, fostering a more stable and predictable project environment, which is a cornerstone of responsible construction practice. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential for material price fluctuations and assume a fixed price will suffice without any contractual provisions for adjustment. This failure to adequately assess and address foreseeable risks violates the professional duty to act with due diligence and competence. It can lead to disputes, claims, and potential financial losses for either party, undermining the integrity of the contractual relationship and potentially contravening regulatory requirements for fair dealing. Another incorrect approach is to unilaterally impose price increases on the client during the project without prior contractual agreement or a transparent, documented process for escalation. This demonstrates a lack of good faith and can be seen as a breach of contract, leading to legal challenges and reputational damage. It disregards the principles of contractual certainty and fair negotiation that are fundamental to the regulatory framework. A third incorrect approach would be to pass all material price fluctuation risk onto the client, without any attempt by the contractor to mitigate or absorb a portion of that risk, especially for materials within the contractor's direct control or for which market trends were reasonably predictable. This represents an unfair allocation of risk and a failure to exercise professional judgment in managing project costs, potentially contravening ethical guidelines that promote equitable risk sharing. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough risk assessment of all potential material price volatilities relevant to the project's scope and duration. This assessment should inform contract negotiations, leading to the selection of appropriate contractual mechanisms for managing these risks. Transparency, clear communication, and adherence to contractual terms are paramount throughout the project lifecycle. Question 12. Investigation of a claim alleging a latent defect in a recently completed commercial building reveals that the defect, though discovered by the owner last month, likely originated during the construction phase several months prior to the project's final completion and issuance of the certificate of occupancy. The insured contractor's products and completed operations coverage policy has an effective date that predates the likely origin of the defect, but extends beyond the project's completion date. Which approach best addresses the risk assessment for this claim? Option A. Deny coverage immediately due to the project's completion, as completed operations coverage typically excludes issues arising after final sign-off. Option B. Rely on the contractor's verbal assurance that the defect was not present at the time of substantial completion, without further investigation. Option C. Assess coverage by examining the policy's effective dates and the definition of occurrence and completed operations in relation to the likely time the defect originated, regardless of the discovery date. Option D. Determine coverage based on the date the defect was discovered by the building owner, as this is when the claim was formally reported. The correct answer is D. Determine coverage based on the date the defect was discovered by the building owner, as this is when the claim was formally reported. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a specialist to navigate the complexities of products and completed operations coverage in the context of a potential claim arising from a construction project. The specialist must accurately assess the risk and determine the appropriate insurance response, considering the policy's limitations and the insured's potential liability. This requires a deep understanding of how coverage applies to latent defects and the timeline of discovery versus occurrence. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation of the project's history, the nature of the alleged defect, and the terms of the products and completed operations coverage. This approach is right because it aligns with the fundamental principles of insurance risk assessment and claims handling. Specifically, it requires verifying the policy's effective dates, the definition of occurrence and completed operations, and any exclusions that might apply. This methodical process ensures that coverage is applied appropriately based on the policy's contractual obligations and the facts of the claim, adhering to regulatory requirements for fair claims practices and policy interpretation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the date of discovery, without considering the policy's effective dates and the definition of an occurrence, would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would likely violate regulatory mandates that require insurers to investigate claims based on the policy terms in effect at the time of the event giving rise to the claim, not merely when the damage is discovered. Another incorrect approach that prematurely denies coverage based on a cursory review of project documentation, without a comprehensive understanding of the policy's completed operations provisions and potential for latent defects, would also be a regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could lead to an improper denial of a valid claim, violating principles of good faith and fair dealing. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or industry gossip rather than factual investigation and policy analysis would be unprofessional. This demonstrates a disregard for established claims investigation protocols and regulatory expectations for evidence-based decision-making. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the policy's terms and conditions. This should be followed by a thorough factual investigation, including gathering all relevant documentation and interviewing key parties. The findings should then be analyzed against the policy provisions and applicable regulations to determine coverage. This structured approach ensures objectivity, fairness, and compliance with all legal and ethical obligations. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a general contractor has subcontracted a portion of a large commercial building project. The subcontract agreement explicitly requires the subcontractor to maintain commercial general liability, CGL, insurance that is primary and non-contributory to the general contractor's own CGL policy. The subcontractor has provided a certificate of insurance naming the general contractor as an additional insured. A third-party claimant has filed a lawsuit against both the general contractor and the subcontractor, alleging bodily injury resulting from faulty work performed by the subcontractor. What is the most appropriate next step for the construction risk and insurance specialist advising the general contractor? Option A. Advise the general contractor that the subcontractor's CGL policy, as evidenced by the certificate of insurance and the subcontract requirement, will respond as primary and non-contributory coverage, and therefore the general contractor's own CGL policy will not be impacted for this claim. Option B. Recommend that the general contractor's own CGL policy respond to the claim, and then pursue recovery from the subcontractor's insurer based on the subcontract agreement and the additional insured endorsement. Option C. Advise the general contractor to deny the claim initially and await further instructions from their own legal counsel before engaging with the subcontractor's insurer. Option D. Obtain and review the actual subcontractor's CGL insurance policy, including all endorsements and the other insurance clause, to confirm the order of coverage and the intent of the policy in relation to the general contractor. The correct answer is A. Advise the general contractor that the subcontractor's CGL policy, as evidenced by the certificate of insurance and the subcontract requirement, will respond as primary and non-contributory coverage, and therefore the general contractor's own CGL policy will not be impacted for this claim. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a specialist to navigate the nuances of third-party coverage in a construction context, specifically concerning the potential for a subcontractor's policy to respond to a claim that originates from a general contractor's contractual obligations. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope of coverage and the potential for gaps or overlaps, which directly impacts risk allocation and financial exposure for all parties involved. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the insurance program adequately protects the interests of the general contractor, while respecting the terms and conditions of the subcontractor's policy. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the subcontractor's commercial general liability, CGL policy, specifically focusing on the other insurance provisions and any endorsements that might affect coverage for the general contractor. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the contractual requirement for the subcontractor to provide primary and non-contributory coverage to the general contractor. By examining the policy's terms, the specialist can confirm whether the subcontractor's CGL policy is indeed intended to respond as primary coverage for claims arising from the subcontractor's work, and whether it will be non-contributory to the general contractor's own insurance. This aligns with standard industry practices and the intent of most contractual risk transfer mechanisms in construction. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the subcontractor's CGL policy automatically provides primary and non-contributory coverage simply because it is listed as a requirement in the subcontract agreement. This is incorrect because the actual policy terms and conditions, including endorsements and exclusions, dictate the scope of coverage. Relying solely on the subcontract agreement without verifying the insurance policy specifics can lead to a false sense of security and potential coverage disputes. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the general contractor to rely solely on their own CGL policy to cover claims arising from the subcontractor's work, without investigating the subcontractor's insurance. This is incorrect because it ignores the contractual obligation of the subcontractor to provide primary and non-contributory coverage. This failure to enforce contractual risk transfer can result in the general contractor bearing costs that should have been covered by the subcontractor's insurance, potentially leading to increased premiums and a less efficient insurance program. A further incorrect approach would be to interpret the subcontractor's CGL policy as excess coverage over the general contractor's policy, regardless of the other insurance clause. This is incorrect because the other insurance clause in the subcontractor's policy is critical in determining its order of coverage. If the clause states that the subcontractor's insurance is primary and non-contributory, then it must be treated as such, and it would respond before the general contractor's policy for the specified scope of work. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all relevant contractual documents and insurance policies. This includes understanding the specific risk allocation provisions in contracts, meticulously examining the terms, conditions, exclusions, and endorsements of all applicable insurance policies, and confirming that the insurance program effectively transfers risk as intended by the parties. Specialists should always verify coverage through policy review, rather than relying solely on contractual statements or assumptions. Question 14. Governance review demonstrates that a large-scale infrastructure project will involve construction activities in 3 different states. The project team has proposed a standardized approach to risk management and insurance coverage across all project sites. As the construction risk and insurance specialist, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance and adequate protection? Option A. Focus solely on the insurance policy terms and conditions, assuming that any state-specific legal issues will be addressed by the project's legal counsel as they arise. Option B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the specific variations in state laws and regulations impacting construction risk and insurance for each of the 3 states, and tailor the risk management and insurance strategies accordingly. Option C. Proceed with the standardized approach as proposed, assuming that general construction insurance principles and federal regulations will adequately cover all project locations. Option D. Delegate the responsibility for researching state-specific legal requirements to the project managers in each respective state and rely on their findings for insurance placement. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the specific variations in state laws and regulations impacting construction risk and insurance for each of the 3 states, and tailor the risk management and insurance strategies accordingly. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because construction projects often operate across state lines, necessitating an understanding of how differing state laws impact risk management and insurance. The specialist must navigate this complexity to ensure compliance and adequate protection for the project. Careful judgment is required to identify and address these variations, as overlooking them can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and analyzing the specific variations in state laws that affect the construction project's risk profile and insurance requirements. This includes understanding differences in contract law, lien rights, workers' compensation mandates, and environmental regulations across the relevant states. By doing so, the specialist can ensure that insurance policies are appropriately tailored, contractual clauses are compliant, and risk mitigation strategies are effective in each jurisdiction. This aligns with the ethical duty of competence and diligence, ensuring that advice and actions are based on a thorough understanding of applicable legal frameworks, as expected of a construction risk and insurance specialist. An incorrect approach that involves applying a single, uniform risk management and insurance strategy across all states without considering local variations is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the fundamental principle that laws differ by jurisdiction, leading to potential noncompliance with specific state requirements. For instance, relying on a standard general liability policy might not adequately cover unique state-specific tort liabilities or statutory obligations. Another incorrect approach is to assume that federal regulations preempt all state-level variations in construction risk and insurance. While federal laws do apply, they do not negate the need to understand and comply with state-specific statutes and case law that govern many aspects of construction and insurance. This assumption can lead to significant gaps in coverage and legal exposure. A further incorrect approach is to delegate the responsibility for understanding state law variations to project managers or legal counsel without direct oversight or validation by the risk and insurance specialist. While collaboration is essential, the specialist's core responsibility is to ensure that risk and insurance strategies are legally sound and comprehensive, which requires direct engagement with the nuances of jurisdictional differences. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify all states where the project will operate. 2. For each state, research and document key differences in relevant laws and regulations impacting construction risk and insurance. 3. Assess the impact of these variations on the project's overall risk profile and insurance needs. 4. Develop and implement risk management and insurance strategies that are compliant with and protective under each applicable state's legal framework. 5. Regularly review and update these strategies as laws or project circumstances change. Question 15. The review process indicates that a major infrastructure project is facing significant pressure to accelerate its construction schedule. The project manager has requested a review of the environmental permitting strategy, suggesting that the team proceed with site preparation and foundation work, while awaiting final approval of the full Environmental Impact Assessment (IA) and associated permits, arguing that this will save valuable time and that any minor environmental disturbances can be rectified later. The specialist is asked to advise on the feasibility and risks of this proposed accelerated approach. Option A. Recommend that the project team proceed with site preparation and foundation work, but only after conducting a preliminary, informal environmental assessment and assuming that the formal EIA will be approved without significant modifications. Option B. Agree to the project manager's request to proceed with site preparation and foundation work, focusing on internal company best practices for environmental management during this phase, and assuring them that any necessary permits will be secured retroactively. Option C. Suggests that the project team prioritize obtaining permits for the initial phases of construction only, deferring the full EIA and permitting for later stages of the project to expedite the overall timeline. Option D. Advise the project manager that proceeding with site preparation and foundation work before obtaining all necessary environmental permits and final EIA approval is a violation of environmental regulations and carries substantial legal and financial risks, recommending adherence to the full permitting process before commencing any work that could impact the environment. Correct answer is D. Advise the project manager that proceeding with site preparation and foundation work before obtaining all necessary environmental permits and final EIA approval is a violation of environmental regulations and carries substantial legal and financial risks, recommending adherence to the full permitting process before commencing any work that could impact the environment. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential conflict between project timelines and the need for thorough environmental impact assessment and permitting. This scenario is professionally challenging because construction projects often operate under strict deadlines and budget constraints, creating pressure to expedite processes. However, environmental regulations are designed to protect public health and natural resources, and noncompliance can lead to severe legal penalties, project delays, reputational damage, and significant remediation costs. The specialist must balance the commercial imperatives of the project with their legal and ethical obligations to ensure environmental compliance. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with relevant environmental regulatory agencies early in the project lifecycle to understand all applicable requirements, including permitting, mitigation, and monitoring. This includes conducting a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, IA, that accurately identifies potential risks and proposes appropriate mitigation strategies. Subsequently, securing all necessary environmental permits before commencing any work that could impact the environment is paramount. This approach ensures that the project is designed and executed in a manner that minimizes environmental harm and adheres to legal mandates, thereby preventing future liabilities and ensuring project continuity. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with construction activities based on an assumption that permits will be obtained later, or that minor environmental impacts can be addressed post-construction. This disregards the fundamental principle that environmental permits are often prerequisites for commencing work, and that retrospective mitigation is frequently more costly and less effective than proactive planning. Such an approach violates environmental laws that mandate pre-construction assessments and approvals, exposing the project to significant fines, stop work orders, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on internal company policies or general industry best practices without verifying their alignment with specific, legally binding environmental regulations in the project's jurisdiction. While internal policies and best practices are valuable, they do not supersede statutory requirements. Failure to consult and comply with the specific environmental laws and regulations of the governing jurisdiction is a direct regulatory failure and an ethical lapse, as it prioritizes expediency over legal obligation and environmental stewardship. A further incorrect approach is to minimize or omit potential environmental risks in the EIA to expedite the approval process. This is a misrepresentation of facts to regulatory bodies and a breach of professional ethics. Environmental regulations are designed to address actual and potential impacts, and deliberately downplaying risks undermines the integrity of the assessment process and the effectiveness of environmental protection measures. This can lead to unforeseen environmental damage, costly remediation, and severe legal repercussions for both the company and the specialist. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This includes 1. Identifying all applicable environmental laws and regulations for the project's location and scope. 2. Engaging qualified environmental consultants to conduct thorough EIAs and develop comprehensive mitigation plans. 3. Consulting with regulatory agencies to clarify requirements and timelines. 4. Integrating environmental considerations into project planning, design, and execution from the outset. 5. Establishing robust monitoring and reporting mechanisms to ensure ongoing compliance. 6. Maintaining open communication with all stakeholders, including regulatory bodies, regarding environmental performance. Question 16. Benchmark analysis indicates that construction projects often face challenges in comprehensively identifying potential risks from the perspective of diverse project stakeholders. Which of the following approaches is most effective in gathering a broad and nuanced understanding of project risks from all relevant parties? Option A. Soliciting input exclusively from senior management and project sponsors regarding their perceived risks. Option B. Conducting structured interviews and facilitated workshops with a wide range of project stakeholders, including site personnel, subcontractors, and design teams. Option C. Reviewing historical project data and industry loss reports to identify common risk patterns. Option D. Focusing solely on risks that have a high probability of occurring, as indicated by preliminary assessments. The correct answer is C. Reviewing historical project data and industry loss reports to identify common risk patterns. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately identifying risks from a stakeholder perspective requires navigating diverse interests, levels of technical understanding, and potential biases. Effective risk identification is foundational to robust construction project management and insurance placement, directly impacting project success and financial viability. The challenge lies in synthesizing potentially conflicting viewpoints into a comprehensive and actionable risk register. The correct approach involves structured interviews and workshops with key stakeholders, utilizing a facilitator to guide discussions and ensure all perspectives are captured. This method allows for probing questions, clarification of concerns, and collaborative identification of risks that might be overlooked by a single individual. This aligns with best practices in risk management, emphasizing comprehensive data gathering and diverse input, which are implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that mandate due diligence and prudent management in construction projects. Ethical considerations also demand that all relevant parties have their concerns heard and addressed, fostering transparency and trust. An approach that relies solely on historical project data without direct stakeholder engagement is incorrect because it may fail to identify unique project-specific risks or emerging issues. While historical data is valuable, it is not exhaustive and cannot account for the nuances of a new project's context, design, or team. This can lead to regulatory noncompliance if risk assessments are deemed insufficient by oversight bodies. Another incorrect approach is to exclusively solicit input from senior management. This is flawed as it overlooks the valuable insights of those directly involved in the day-to-day operations and execution of the project, such as site supervisors, tradespeople, and subcontractors. Their practical experience often reveals risks that are not apparent at a higher strategic level, and failing to solicit their input can lead to incomplete risk identification, potentially violating contractual obligations or industry standards for safety and quality. Finally, an approach that prioritizes only risks with a high probability of occurrence, while neglecting those with lower probability but potentially catastrophic impact, is also professionally unsound. This selective focus can lead to significant unforeseen losses and liabilities, potentially contravening the duty of care expected of construction professionals and insurers. A comprehensive risk identification process must consider the full spectrum of potential risks, regardless of their perceived likelihood, to ensure adequate mitigation and insurance strategies are developed. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic and inclusive approach to risk identification. This includes defining the scope of the risk identification process, identifying all relevant stakeholders, selecting appropriate techniques for engaging them, e.g., interviews, workshops, surveys, documenting identified risks, and then prioritizing and analyzing them. Professionals must remain objective, actively listen to all input, and ensure that the identified risks are clearly understood and documented, forming the basis for subsequent risk management activities. Question 17. Assessment of how a construction risk and insurance specialist should differentiate between direct and indirect losses when evaluating a claim for damage to a partially completed commercial building due to a fire, considering the policy's coverage for physical damage and business interruption. Option A. Classify all losses, including the cost of repairs, debris removal, and lost rental income during the repair period, as direct losses if they are a consequence of the fire. Option B. Treat all financial losses, including the cost of repairs and lost profits, as direct losses, as long as they are not explicitly excluded by the policy. Option C. Consider only the cost of physical repairs to the building as a direct loss, and all other consequential financial impacts as uninsurable. Option D. Distinguish between the cost of physical repairs to the building and debris removal as direct losses, and lost rental income as an indirect loss, requiring specific policy coverage for business interruption. The correct answer is A. Classify all losses, including the cost of repairs, debris removal, and lost rental income during the repair period, as direct losses if they are a consequence of the fire. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because accurately distinguishing between direct and indirect losses in construction insurance claims requires a nuanced understanding of contractual obligations, policy wordings, and the causal chain of events. Misclassification can lead to underpayment or overpayment of claims, disputes with insurers, and potential breaches of professional duty. The specialist must navigate complex factual circumstances to apply the correct principles. The correct approach involves a meticulous examination of the policy's definition of covered losses and the direct causal link between the insured peril and the loss incurred. This requires understanding that direct losses are typically physical damage to insured property, while indirect losses are consequential financial losses arising from that damage. For instance, the cost of repairing a damaged building is a direct loss, whereas lost rental income due to the building's unavailability is an indirect loss. The specialist must adhere to the principles of indemnity, ensuring the insured is placed in the same financial position as they were before the loss, without allowing for betterment. This aligns with the fundamental principles of insurance as practiced within the UK regulatory framework, which emphasizes fairness and transparency in claims handling. An incorrect approach would be to broadly categorize all losses stemming from an insured event as direct losses, without considering the specific policy terms and the nature of the loss. This fails to recognize the distinction between physical damage and consequential financial impacts, potentially leading to claims being settled incorrectly and in violation of policy conditions. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any loss not explicitly excluded is covered as a direct loss. This ignores the necessity of establishing a direct causal link between the insured peril and the loss, and the specific definitions within the policy that differentiate between direct and indirect coverage. Such an approach risks misinterpreting the scope of coverage and could lead to disputes and regulatory scrutiny for failing to apply policy terms accurately. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough review of the insurance policy, including definitions and exclusions. This should be followed by a detailed investigation of the facts to establish the sequence of events and the nature of each loss incurred. Applying the principles of direct and indirect loss, as defined by the policy and relevant case law, is crucial. If ambiguity exists, seeking clarification from the insurer or legal counsel is a prudent step to ensure accurate claims assessment and adherence to regulatory expectations. Question 18. Upon reviewing the proposed insurance program for a large commercial construction project, the client expresses strong reservations about the cost of site pollution liability (SPL) coverage, stating it is an unnecessary expense and requesting its complete exclusion from the policy. The project involves extensive excavation, the use of various chemicals for site preparation, and is located near a sensitive wetland area. As the construction risk and insurance specialist, what is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough site-specific risk assessment to identify potential pollution exposures, clearly communicate these risks and the benefits of adequate SPL coverage to the client, and document the discussion and the client's final decision regarding coverage. Option B. Proceed with the exclusion of SPL coverage without further discussion, assuming the client has sufficient knowledge of construction risks to make this decision independently. Option C. Agree to the client's request to exclude SPL coverage entirely, as the client is the ultimate decision maker on their insurance program. Option D. Recommend a very basic SPL policy with minimal coverage limits to appease the client's cost concerns while technically fulfilling a coverage requirement. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough site-specific risk assessment to identify potential pollution exposures, clearly communicate these risks and the benefits of adequate SPL coverage to the client, and document the discussion and the client's final decision regarding coverage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire to minimize immediate costs and the specialist's ethical and regulatory obligation to ensure adequate coverage for potential, albeit uncertain, future pollution events. The specialist must balance client advocacy with professional responsibility, recognizing that underestimating or omitting coverage for site pollution liability can lead to severe financial and reputational damage for the client, and potential professional liability for the specialist. Careful judgment is required to assess the specific risks associated with the construction project and the surrounding environment, and to translate that assessment into appropriate insurance recommendations. The correct approach involves a thorough risk assessment and a clear, transparent explanation to the client about the potential exposures and the benefits of site pollution liability (SPL) coverage. This approach aligns with the principles of professional conduct that require specialists to act in the best interests of their clients by providing informed advice, and to comply with regulatory expectations that mandate appropriate risk management strategies. Specifically, it upholds the duty of care by ensuring the client is made aware of significant risks and has the opportunity to mitigate them through insurance. It also reflects a commitment to ethical practice by prioritizing the client's long-term well-being over short-term cost savings. An incorrect approach of simply agreeing to the client's request to exclude SPL coverage without a detailed discussion and risk assessment fails to meet the professional standard of care. This omission constitutes a failure to adequately advise the client on material risks, potentially violating professional conduct guidelines that emphasize informed decision-making. It also risks noncompliance with any applicable regulatory frameworks that might implicitly or explicitly require consideration of such liabilities in construction projects, especially if the project involves activities with a known potential for pollution. Another incorrect approach of proceeding with the exclusion based solely on the client's directive, without documenting the discussion or the client's explicit acknowledgement of the risks, is professionally negligent. This lack of documentation leaves the specialist vulnerable to claims of inadequate advice should a pollution event occur. It also demonstrates a failure to uphold the principle of transparency and informed consent, which are cornerstones of ethical client relationships. A further incorrect approach of recommending a minimal SPL policy that does not adequately cover the identified risks, even if technically purchased, is also professionally unsound. This approach might satisfy a superficial requirement for coverage, but fails to provide meaningful protection. It represents a misapplication of insurance principles and a disregard for the client's actual exposure, thereby failing to fulfill the specialist's duty to provide appropriate risk management solutions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Conducting a comprehensive site-specific risk assessment, considering project activities, historical site use, and environmental factors. 2. Identifying potential pollution exposures and their potential consequences. 3. Researching and understanding available SPL coverage options and their limitations. 4. Clearly communicating the identified risks and recommended coverage to the client, including the rationale for the recommendation and the potential consequences of inadequate coverage. 5. Documenting all discussions, recommendations, and client decisions. And 6. Ensuring the final insurance program aligns with the client's risk tolerance and regulatory requirements. Question 19. Benchmark analysis indicates that following a significant structural failure on a large commercial construction project, the general contractor's insurer has paid a substantial claim to the project owner. The insurer believes a specific subcontractor's work directly caused the failure. However, the construction contract between the owner and the general contractor includes a broad indemnity clause in favor of the owner and a waiver of subrogation clause that purports to waive all rights of recovery against the owner's contractors and subcontractors. The insurer is now considering pursuing the subcontractor directly for the amount paid. What is the most appropriate course of action for the insurer? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the insurance policy, the construction contract, specifically the waiver of subrogation clause, and relevant state statutes to determine the enforceability of the waiver before proceeding. Option B. Immediately initiate legal proceedings against the subcontractor to recover the claim payment, as the subcontractor's negligence is evident. Option C. Seek to recover the claim payment from the general contractor, as they are ultimately responsible for the work of their subcontractors. Option D. Abandon the subrogation claim entirely, as the presence of a waiver of subrogation clause in the construction contract automatically negates any right of recovery. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate legal proceedings against the subcontractor to recover the claim payment, as the subcontractor's negligence is evident. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of subrogation rights within the specific regulatory framework governing construction insurance in the United States, as implied by the CRIS exam's typical jurisdiction. The core challenge lies in balancing the insurer's right to recover losses from a negligent third party with the contractual obligations and potential impact on project stakeholders. A specialist must navigate potential contractual waivers of subrogation, statutory limitations, and the ethical imperative to act in good faith. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the insurance policy, the construction contract, and any applicable state statutes to determine the enforceability of the subrogation claim. This includes verifying if the policy contains a waiver of subrogation clause that would preclude the insurer from pursuing the subcontractor. If no such waiver exists and the subcontractor's negligence is demonstrably the cause of the loss, the insurer has a right to subrogate. This approach is justified by the fundamental principle of subrogation, which aims to prevent unjust enrichment by ensuring that the party responsible for the loss ultimately bears its cost, thereby maintaining the integrity of the insurance system and promoting accountability within the construction industry. Adherence to these legal and contractual provisions is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to immediately pursue the subcontractor without first confirming the existence and enforceability of a waiver of subrogation in the construction contract or insurance policy. This failure to conduct due diligence could lead to a breach of contract, a violation of insurance regulations that may require good faith claims handling, and potentially expose the insurer to legal challenges from the subcontractor or the insured owner. Another incorrect approach would be to abandon the subrogation claim solely based on the subcontractor's assertion of non-negligence, without conducting an independent investigation into the cause of the loss. This bypasses the insurer's right to recover and could be seen as a failure to act diligently on behalf of the insured and the insurer's own financial interests, potentially violating principles of sound claims management and fiduciary duty. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to attempt to recover from the subcontractor in a manner that circumvents established legal procedures or contractual agreements, such as through informal pressure or threats. This would not only be unethical, but could also violate various consumer protection laws and insurance regulations designed to ensure fair claims practices. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive review of all relevant documentation. This includes the insurance policy, the construction contract, paying close attention to indemnity clauses and waiver of subrogation provisions, and any project-specific agreements. Following this, an independent investigation into the cause of the loss should be conducted to establish negligence. Legal counsel specializing in construction insurance should be consulted to interpret complex contractual language and assess the strength of the subrogation claim under applicable state law. The decision to pursue subrogation should be based on a clear understanding of legal rights, contractual obligations, and the potential for successful recovery, always operating within ethical boundaries and regulatory requirements. Question 20. Performance analysis shows that a contractor's general liability insurance policy is being called upon to respond to a claim from a third party. The claim alleges that the contractor's defective installation of a critical component in the third party's manufacturing equipment caused significant downtime and damage to other sensitive machinery within the equipment. The contractor's policy contains a standard, your work, exclusion, but it also has endorsements that may broaden coverage for resulting damage. What is the most appropriate initial step for the construction risk and insurance specialist to take in advising the contractor and managing this claim? Option A. Advise the contractor to immediately deny the claim as it falls under the your work exclusion. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the general liability policy, including all endorsements, and the specific allegations in the claim to determine the scope of potential coverage for the alleged downtime and damage to other machinery. Option C. Recommend the contractor settle the claim directly with the third party to avoid insurer involvement. Option D. Inform the contractor that general liability policies never cover claims related to faulty workmanship. The correct answer is A. Advise the contractor to immediately deny the claim as it falls under the your work exclusion. Explanation. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation because it requires the construction risk and insurance specialist to navigate a complex interplay between contractual obligations, potential third-party claims, and the nuances of general liability insurance coverage. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope of the insurer's duty to defend and indemnify, especially when the underlying claim involves allegations of both faulty workmanship and consequential damages that may or may not be covered. Careful judgment is required to avoid both underinsuring the project and incurring unnecessary premium costs, while also ensuring compliance with the policy's terms and conditions and relevant legal principles. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the general liability policy, specifically focusing on the definitions of occurrence, property damage, and any exclusions that might apply to faulty workmanship or resulting damage. It also necessitates understanding the insured's contractual obligations to the third party and how those might translate into insurable risks under the general liability policy. The specialist must then engage with the insurer, providing all relevant documentation and a clear, reasoned analysis of why the claim, or parts of it, should be covered under the policy's insuring agreements, while also acknowledging any potentially uninsurable aspects. This proactive and informed engagement ensures that the insured's interests are protected, the insurer is properly notified and provided with the necessary information to fulfill its obligations, and that the specialist acts ethically and competently in advising their client. This aligns with the professional duty to act in the best interests of the client and to provide accurate and informed advice regarding insurance coverage. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny coverage based on a superficial understanding of the faulty workmanship exclusion. Many general liability policies do not exclude damage caused by faulty workmanship, but rather the faulty workmanship itself. If the faulty work leads to damage to other property or bodily injury, that resulting damage may be covered. Failing to differentiate between the work itself and its consequences is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it could lead to the wrongful denial of a valid claim and a breach of the duty to defend. Another incorrect approach would be to assume the insurer will automatically cover all aspects of the claim without providing a detailed analysis. This passive stance abdicates the specialist's responsibility to advocate for their client and to ensure the policy is interpreted and applied correctly. It risks overlooking critical policy provisions or failing to present a compelling case for coverage, potentially leading to the insured bearing costs that should have been covered. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and professional competence. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise the insured to settle the claim with a third party without consulting the insurer or understanding the coverage implications. This could prejudice the insurer's position and potentially void coverage if the settlement is not reasonable or if it admits liability for something that is clearly excluded. It also fails to leverage the potential defense provided by the general liability policy, which is a key benefit of such coverage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the policy, the claim details, and relevant contractual provisions. The specialist should then formulate a clear position on coverage, supported by policy language and legal principles, and communicate this position effectively to both the insured and the insurer. This involves a commitment to thoroughness, accuracy, and ethical advocacy for the client's interests within the framework of the insurance contract and applicable regulations.